Hi guys, Dan here at Trojan Art Painting, making this video in response to Dread Lunn asking the question, fact or fiction wargaming, wanting to know if we play fantasy / sci-fi or historical, what we prefer and why. For me, it's historical. The only time I ever play fantasy or sci-fi is if the folks in my area are playing that, and that's the only game I can get in. Or in order to get them to play my historical stuff, I'll play their fantasy stuff. So, but over the years, I've really not ever played any fantasy to the extent. And having said that, I live right down the street from Reaper, so I do play Warlord, but again, only because that's what the fellows there play, and I play in the tournament every year at ReaperCon. If you look on my past videos on my channel, you'll see some my Children of the Great Pumpkin Necropolis army. I had a Resurrection Crusaders army, which was an army of Crusader Knights, but they were skeletons, but they still had on all their tattered uniforms and carried their Crusader shields and such. I had a Marauding Marines of Mauritius, which again was supposed to be pirate skeletons, but I proxied like British Marines for them. And I've had a Reptus army, which are lizards and dragons and things like that. But again, I paint anything for my clients, and Warlord doesn't require a large number of figures, maybe 20 figures at the most for an army, so it's no big deal for me to paint a few of those things and play those games with those guys, which I enjoy hanging around with. Also, having said that, probably the funnest game I ever played was Space Hulk. Played it back, oh man, 1989 or 90, a long time ago. I don't look down or have anything against fantasy or sci-fi. I certainly understand the draw, but for me, I'm not really into some made-up world. I find the real world plenty fascinating. My earliest memories growing up are of living in the Mojave Desert in Southern California at the 29 Palms Marine Corps base. My dad was an officer in the Marines, but he was never there. He's always gone to Okinawa or Vietnam or somewhere. To give you kind of a time frame, I remember asking my mom why the flag was flying funny and why it looked different. And I don't remember at the time, because I was so little, I don't remember at the time her explaining it to me, but I remember her crying about it. And it was at half-mast because President Kennedy had been assassinated. Anyway, we stayed busy out there. Like I said, my dad was never around, but Mom would like cut the end off of a cracker box and send us out into the desert. We'd chase horny toads. We couldn't catch any other lizards but horny toads, like this little fella here. But we had a lot of fun doing that, riding horses. And that's also where I have my earliest memories of playing what eventually led to wargaming. We played with Mom's curlers. Didn't have any toy soldiers, but we would line her curlers up in the hallway, at each end of the hallway, and put the pins through them, make it look like they were holding guns, and then we'd throw balls at each other's guys, rubber balls, and try to knock them down, and had all kind of fun with that. Eventually, we did talk her into buying us some soldiers that were advertised in the back of the comic books. Now these guys were always fascinating. They were wonderful advertisements for that day. And when they arrived, I remember the shock and disappointment. They advertised them as footlockers full of toy soldiers, and I remember we had imagined them, this huge box arriving and overflowing with so many soldiers that we wouldn't be able to count them. And what we got instead was something a little different. They were these little small, flat, hard plastic soldiers. I remember the first set we got were Revolutionary War. The British were red and the Americans were blue. Still see them advertised on eBay from time to time, but they're pretty expensive. Then, of course, like all fine boys do, we moved on to the 2-inch tall, ubiquitous green toy soldiers. Even got some of the big 8-inch tall guys that were really cool, and I think are still cool today. Anyway, I don't know how many hundreds of those green soldiers we lost out in the desert. We had dig trenches and bombard each other's trench lines with dirt clods and rocks, and of course many of them would be buried that way. But then also when Mom would call us in as it got dark, we'd be hurriedly trying to gather up all our troops as darkness fell. And of course we missed many of them, so there's untold numbers of our troops still laying out there, buried in the desert, I'm sure. When my father went overseas for the last time, the family moved back to Dallas. And when my father got back, he did his last year in the Marine Corps at Quantico, Virginia, just south of Washington, D.C., 1,300 miles from Dallas. And he was teaching new officers at the Marine Corps' officer training school there at Quantico. And anyway, me and my brother flew out there in the summer of 1966 for a week and stayed with him in the officers' quarters. We slept on cots in his room. It was great. And I remember early one morning he took us out to the battlefield at Manassas, or Bull Run. It was early in the morning. There was still dew on the grass and the sun was low. And he took us to Henry House Hill. I remember standing there, a little kid, looking up at that majestic statue of Stonewall Jackson. That was awesome. Then he took us to see the Star Spangled Banner. And, that pretty much did it for me. I was a lifelong military history type guy after that. So anyway, back in Dallas, I remember getting my first box of Airfix soldiers at a store called Benjamin Franklin. They sold them at Benjamin Franklin and M.E. Moses was the other store I remember they sold them at. I remember you could get not quite 3 boxes for $1. I think they were like 39 cents a box. So if I was very judicious with my lunch money, for a couple of weeks I could go in there and with my allowance, etc., I could get me several boxes. And it was just fascinating. They had this one section back by in the toy section that was probably 4 or 5 feet wide, and just had row after row after row of these soldiers. And every time I went in there, it was just wonderful. And it was just so hard to decide which boxes I wanted out of all those wonderful boxes of Airfix soldiers there. It was about 3 years later that I played Risk for the first time. And heck, we still play that game. The game we played back then had the old wooden playing pieces. How long ago that was. Now, I said I've always been a historical gamer. Now, the first, really what got me into it, I don't know, my dad being in the military and playing with toy soldiers as I was a little kid. And then I remember the first book my dad ever bought me was for, I was in 5th grade. And it was at the mall and he bought it for me. It was this book, Great Military Battles by Cyril Falls. Now the version I got was the bookstore version. It was a little smaller than this, and over the years, and that was, as I said, 5th grade, so I was 10 years old, so it was set in 1971. This book first came out and was copyrighted in 64. But I mean, it's got this beautiful pictures all through it. And it covers, well, that's so much for that idea, but anyway, it covers battles all throughout history. And man, the original one he bought me, here's Yenna Auerstadt, the famous painting. The one he bought me, it literally, I read it so much and carried it around everywhere I went, it literally fell apart. It fell apart on me. So a few years ago, I picked up this larger, actually even nicer version of it to remember the good old days by. And I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I'd even have my dad like quiz me on, he'd say the date and I'd tell him what battle it was, or he'd say the battle and I'd tell him who the commanders were or what happened. And it begins Rockaway in 1643, Blenheim, Poltava, Fontenoy, and it goes all the way through history. And the last battle is the Ardennes. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 World War II battles in it, 4 World War I, Port Arthur, Gravelotte, St. Privet. It's got 2 American Civil War, Balaclava, 3 Napoleonic, being Jena, Borodino, and Waterloo. So I mean, that really got me started as just a fascinating book. But I've just, all my life, I've just, read everything I could find on different battles, campaigns, different wars. The political part I'm not that fascinated by. What really fascinates me, I love the uniforms, especially from the Napoleonics, my favorite era. Just the tactics that were used, comparing tactics used through the years, how weapons have developed and evolved, and how men were led, and the men that led them to go out and risk getting blown to pieces. Now the first proper war game I ever owned was Avalon Hill's D-Day. I had seen it in a toy store in Irving that I had gone into to get some of my Airfix soldiers, and they had a section for had a bunch of Avalon Hill games in it. But the price was just prohibitive. I mean, they were, I think it was $5. And back then, this was 1970, and $5, it might as well have been, you know, $500. But I mentioned to my dad that I saw it and what a neat looking game it was. And I'll be darned if a couple nights later he didn't walk in the door, you know, the front door getting home from work, and he had it. And he had never done that before. You know, the only time we ever got anything like that was at Christmas. You know, we'd ask for something, he'd say, okay, put it on your Christmas list. I'll never forget that. It was really cool. And from there, I moved on to other Avalon Hill games. Gettysburg, Africa Corps, the Russian Campaign, Guns of August, War at Sea, and Victory in the Pacific. Then came Panzer Blitz and its companion, Panzer Leader, which really changed things. They were about as close to a tabletop game as had ever been accomplished by a board game. After these came games like Upfront and Squad Leader and Advanced Squad Leader, but those were just way too complicated for me. When I returned home in 1984, after being overseas for 3 years, I discovered Axis and Allies. Love that game, still play it. Then one day in Hawaii, in Honolulu in 1987, my life changed forever when I walked into a little gaming store called Just for Fun, run by a fellow named Glenn Fong. It had 2 walls with nothing but from ceiling to floor figures, A10 packs deep, metal 15 millimeter mainly, but some 25 millimeter stuff. He had Dixon and Essex miniatures in little boxes, and these had all the Osprey books and the Courier magazine, Wargames Illustrated, stuff I'd never even seen or knew about. I don't think if he wouldn't have made me leave when he closed, I might still be there. And that's when I was first introduced into Napoleonic tabletop wargaming. The Napoleonic era is, you know, that's what my homegrown rules I work on, I've showed over and over again on my channel, are based on. It's for me the most fascinating just because it's the high point of the rock, paper, scissors with infantry, artillery, and cavalry idea, where they're all pretty equally matched and equally important. And I don't think in any other time in history was everything so balanced between the three different arms. Of course, being as close to America's Civil War as I am, being from where I'm from and how the experiences I've had, I enjoy that too. But it's pretty, the battles just aren't that interesting to fight and refight, and the armies are, you know, ugly basically. But so it pretty much narrowing it down further and further and further to historical, you know, and then down into horse and musket era, and then Napoleonic would be it for me. Another thing to support Napoleonic gaming is just the sheer amount of reference material that's available. Not only for uniforms, but I mean, if I want to know how Napoleon's army was organized, you know, I mean, there's dozens of books. Probably the 2 best are by John Elting, Swords Around a Throne, and by George Blonde, La Grande Armée. How his guard was organized. Of course, the classic is by N.S.K. Brown and Henri Lachouc, the Anatomy of Glory. Have a first edition copy of that. You know, numerous books written on the tactics and everything. So there's no shortage of reference material available for it too. And it was such a long period. You know, over 20 years that period lasted, and involved, you know, every country in Europe. So it's got such a broad range of armies, nations involved. Now, you know, I also think like 7 Years' War is pretty cool, and Spanish Succession, because of the personalities involved and the uniforms, are pretty cool. But there wasn't the balance between the different arms, and there's just not as much information, especially in English, available for those wars. So. Now, the group I gamed with in Hawaii played Empire 2nd edition, then 3rd edition, 4th edition. After I left there, we gravitated toward Napoleon's Battles by Lunn, and we tried other gaming systems too. And there's still new rule sets coming out all the time. But eventually, I just stuck with my homegrown rules. I've just kind of concentrated on working on those and playing those over the last few years, my Dress to Kill rules. Now, at one time, I gamed a lot of 15mm Ancients as well. If you remember the old WRG, I think it reached its height of popularity in 6th edition. Then when Phil Barker came out with this, which is 7th edition, for our club it dropped off dramatically, and people started looking at different rules like Tactica and DBA and DBM and Scott Bowden's Ancients rules. But WRG there for a couple years. Here's the old DBA book, still got it. And then here's the 6th edition rules that we played so heavily. And then, of course, folks that played at that time remember the 3 Army List books that covered, you know, early, middle, and late ancient period. I had one army for each period. For the early ancients period, I had Carthaginians. They were fascinating because the Army List was just, you know, so diverse, you know, and elephants were always cool. For the middle period, I had Sung Chinese, which were, the morale were just horrible, but you could get, you know, they were so cheap because their morale was bad, you'd get a whole bunch of them. And plus they had, you know, rockets and all kind of neat artillery. So I had Sung Chinese for the middle, and for the late period I had Swiss. So I had a little bit of everything. I had the Carthaginian early, which was a, you know, pretty good army. You could get some Class A troops and elephants and just a wide variety of figures. Second period was the Sung Chinese army, the big huge army that was pretty horrible morale. And then third was the Swiss, the Swiss army, which I had, which was just, you know, nobody wanted to play because they were just, you know, too devastating. But anyway, we had fun while that lasted. But then, as I said, when 7th edition came out, people just kind of went their different ways with it, into Tactica and other games, and we eventually just stopped playing it. I really liked Artie Conliff's Tactica, and it just really didn't catch on with my group. After the service, I finished up my degree and eventually became the curator at the Vicksburg Battlefield Museum in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So naturally there, gaming tended to be of the American Civil War variety. Well, we played Johnny Rep and all its versions. Eventually shifted over to Fire and Fury, and today we still play some, but we play Fire and Fury Regimental. Also played lots of The Sword and the Flame, British Colonial. Always been interested in that period. We had lots of fun doing that as well. And as I mentioned earlier, I do play Warlord. We have ReaperCon coming up in less than a month with our annual tournament, so looking forward to that. But really for me, as far as gaming, the main emphasis is still on my own rules, my Dress to Kill rules. We just try to keep it simple, but keep it fun and keep it interesting. Keep things moving fast. We don't want to get bogged down in too many details. That's why we play imagination style of game for our Napoleonics. Alright, that was another ramble. That's one of my trademarks, I guess. Pretty passionate about the hobby. Sometimes you get me talking, you ain't gonna shut me up. So it's your fault for asking the question, Dredd. But hey man, I really enjoy your channel. Wish I could understand you better. Wish you damn foreigners learn how to speak English a little better. You might be able to communicate. Need to work on that. Anyway, man, keep doing what you're doing now. I'll keep watching. Alright, see you.